Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I request you all to kindly rise from your seats for national anthem.
Recording in progress.
Ladies and gentlemen, I now request your attention for recitation of Holy Quran.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In the name of Allah, the entirely merciful, the especially merciful.
يؤتي الحكمة من يشاء ومن يؤت الحكمة فقد أوتي خيرا كثيرا وما يذكر إلا أولو الألباب.
He gives wisdom to whom He wills, and whoever has been given wisdom has certainly been given much good, and none will remember except those of understanding.
صدق الله العظيم.
Jazakallah. To showcase CAS's work, we shall now see a small montage and listen to a brief message by President CAS.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. CAS was established in 2019 to fill in the knowledge and research gaps that existed in the domains of aerospace and national security in an otherwise think tank rich capital Islamabad. To achieve our objective of being amongst the best think tanks of the region and with focused mission, CAS has made significant contributions by providing policy guidelines on important issues of national interest, especially security, both in military and non-military domains, disseminated through direct as well as indirect engagement on regular basis. As part of the advisory board of the Government of Pakistan's National Security Division, CAS has and would continue to serve as a thought leader by providing independent, innovative, evidence-based solutions to strengthen Pakistan's national security, including specific emerging geostrategic and geo-economic situations. Maintaining a winning aerospace power requires high-end technologies that are not only cost-intensive, but their availability with the passage of time is likely to be challenging. In our region, these technologies are largely acquired. Therefore, working towards our vision of strengthening national security in all its domains through indigenization, CAS would continue to lay emphasis on innovative research on emerging technologies, including but not limited to cyber and space. We continue to enhance our reach through greater use of media, seminars, webinars, digital technologies, joint research, and cementing our relationship with domestic, regional, and global partners. Inshallah, in times ahead, we will continue to build upon our achievements.
I would now like to request President Kass, Ambassador Jalil Abbas Jilani, and Honorable Ms. Hina Rabbani Khar to kindly take your seats on the stage. I kindly request the audience to please switch off your mobile phones or put them on silent mode. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to open the seminar by thanking the Honorable Keynote Speaker, Minister Hina Rabbani Khar Sahaba, and distinguished members of the panel, Ambassador Riaz Khokhar, former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan, General Aamer Riaz, former President, National Defense University, Dr. Usman Chohan, and Squadron Leader Masood. We are going to discuss the Ukrainian crisis, which has certainly created a lot of upheaval, not only between the Europeans, Russia, the United States of America, but it has implications for, I think, every country in the world. The crisis has generated several challenges for Pakistan as well. While we were grappling with the after effects of COVID-19 and just trying to get back on our feet, this Ukrainian crisis has certainly created enormous challenges for Pakistan. Enormous challenges, political challenges, strategic challenges, as well as economic challenges. There are many questions which are being raised. Political questions, whether neutrality is the game, whether Pakistan can remain neutral. But then neutrality by the Western countries and the United States of America is also being seen as hostility or siding with Russia. So that's the kind of a message that we keep getting from the Europeans on an informal basis. I am not really sure whether the same message is also being conveyed at the official level. And then the economic situation that we are faced with. The prices of commodity, two important commodities, energy, oil, gas, and also the food items, which are certainly reaching beyond the affordability of a common man. So these are some of the important questions that are going to be discussed. And we can't think of a better keynote speaker than Minister Hina Rabbani Khar Sahaba. She is extremely knowledgeable about domestic issues, economic issues, and also regional and global issues. I was fortunate to have worked with her when she was the Foreign Minister of Pakistan as her Foreign Secretary. And I can tell you that the kind of respect that she enjoyed at the international level, that was also unprecedented. And she made significant contributions in the formulation of Pakistan's foreign policy direction, whether it pertained to Pakistan-India relations, whether US-Pakistan relations, or Afghanistan, or for that matter, the situation in the Middle East. She was extremely candid and forthright in her interaction with the foreign leaders, and I think that also made a lot of difference. And then she also proved that in case the civilian leadership, they are knowledgeable, they know their work properly, then certainly you can change or you can set the course of foreign policy direction. With these brief remarks, Madam Minister, I would request you to give your keynote address on this very, very important issue. Thank you.
Thank you. And allow me to just first of all begin with an apology. I take being on time very, very seriously, and you can be rest assured if I thought that it was okay to make people like Riaz, Khokhar Sahab wait, they really did a quick cost-benefit analysis of the 15 minutes I had to overspend at the ministry. And that's all my apologies. And Jalil is much more generous to me now that both of us are not in our previous position than he was to me when we were in office. And that's the beauty of, I think, working well with people, that you tend to always have wide discussion. And my goal over here today also is, and that's why I asked, Chatham House rules apply? I believe they don't. So I will be slightly careful, but I would still want to be, I would want to be honest in our assessment of what the situation is, as we are typically with our, with whoever we interact with. So what I'm going to try and do in the next 15 to 20 minutes is perhaps not spend too much time on what an audience like this already knows. We know what happened. So the overview, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on some of the issues that Jalil Ambassador Jalil and Foreign Secretary Jalil spent a lot of time on, are ones which I'm not going to touch upon much also. I would like to go into the nuances of what is happening in the world, in how the world is treating this crisis, looking at this crisis, and what it means for countries like Pakistan, and what are our policy options, okay? And I would maybe perhaps in that vein try and break this myth of are we sovereign or are we not? I think we do more damage to ourselves. Do we need this? We do more damage to ourselves when we underreport our own sovereignty. And I think leadership that does that doesn't do us any favors. And I mean across the spectrum. So I'm not pointing out at anyone at all. I'm just talking about generalities over here. So what is the overview? Pakistan is found in a situation where Pakistan has to say, okay, what are our ties with the two countries which are in the game? And then Pakistan is to see, then Pakistan is forced to say, oh, but we don't only look at the ties of these two, with these two specific countries, because clearly there is an overhang, an overwhelming expectation of other countries which have put themselves even more directly in the ring than it seems the countries which were in the ring in the first place, right? Do a quick assessment of our ties with the two countries. With Ukraine, we have economic, trade, educational, and defense ties, pretty strong, pretty decent. We have been importing wheat. There's been some defense ties with them also. With Russia, as someone, 13 years back or so, For the last 2 decades, even before our previous government, but I think we gave it a major push, we started engaging with them in a real manner. Because the Cold War politics had died down by then, and no more the alignments of the past held true. And we really gave it a big push as a country, as the state of Pakistan, as Pakistan. And then we find ourselves with them in trade, in energy cooperation, talks of energy cooperation, defense and security cooperation, counterterrorism, and converging views on regional issues. And many times we've found that the Soviet Union that we fought in many ways in Afghanistan, when the new the second phase of Afghanistan came in, we found that we had a convergence of opinion on how we wanted that to play out. And that was perhaps more because of our geographical realities, that both were found in themselves in the greater broader region, than anything else. But there was a great deal of convergence on when they talked about what they wanted in Afghanistan, when we talked about what we wanted in Afghanistan. This time talking 10 years back or so, and going forward. There is collaboration at the multilateral fora. So typically, as in many, many decades back, you would always find yourself on the other side of the divide. You would increasingly stop finding yourself like that. Now, I also want to say this very clearly, because I think many a times our hostility or our concerns or our history with one country forces us to look at the other country in a slightly different light. So a lot of countries, for some countries, our positioning with Russia tends to be an anti-US positioning. It should never be that. It should never be that, right? And also, I want to challenge the equation of our ties with Russia with our ties with China. Okay, so the question, if a similar thing had happened vis-a-vis China, where would Pakistan stand, has to have a different answer than if a similar thing has happened to Russia, and where does Pakistan stand? So that difference, I think, is an important one. Okay, now within the policy framework, our experience, first of all, I think we are a country which must not unlearn what we know. We bring something to the region, we bring something to the world, we bring something based on what we've experienced. And we have experienced conflict on our borders, right? So war and conflict can never be in anyone's favor. We also know that its impact is devastating, it is long-lasting, its repercussions and ramifications go into decades, even when the war and conflict has ended. And people have wrapped up their bags and left. The repercussions and ramifications continue to haunt. We also have serious concerns at the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, obviously, as we did in humanitarian crises that happened within the region. And we are concerned about casualties on both sides, and we never think that that is a good idea to have. And we had concerns over the failure of negotiations and dialogue, and for us to be at a point where there was the possibility of war in Europe. We have concerns over massive outflows of refugees, internal displacement of people in Ukraine, and as I said, this is all close to us because we have, on our border areas, experienced similar things. So we know the cost, and we understand the repercussions. We understand that those who casually talk about it in strategic terms don't have to experience the hardship that our people had to have. Hardship. The strategic talkers move, but the people on whose soil this hardship comes, and so the soil cannot move, and the people can't move, and you have to experience it in all its form. So, so therefore, what has been Pakistan's position? And I could tell you exactly what our stated position is in one paragraph, and I would not choose to do that because then I would be wasting your time because it's already there, right? And I would tell you a slightly more nuanced version of that. And that is, first of all, we have non-partisan, jisko gair janabdarana kehte hain, right? Has remained our consistent position. That government, this government, non-partisan. We are a sovereign country. We cannot be forced to take sides when it's a sovereign decision not to be non-partisan, right? It's a sovereign decision. Now, the main tenets of that policy are primacy, universality, and consistent application of international law. Primacy, universality, emphasis on that. Universality of international law, not exceptions. We will apply it here, but we will not apply it here. We'll look this way, but we will choose not to look at it when it's the other way. indispensability of the equal security for all. We've experienced many things, preemptive strikes, notions of who is feeling how much threatened on security. And if we want to take a threat perception high, any country can take its threat perception to be as high as they want it to be. Now, in reaction to that high threat perception, if you start doing things that might be against international law, do we give it a cover of legality? I would say not. Not in this case, not in any other case. And I'm speaking from both sides right now, so please don't consider me to be insinuating on one. I'm literally speaking on how you look at the threat perception, which is very high on both sides. Dialogue and diplomacy, unfortunately, has to, should have been the basis of the resolution of any threat perception, fear, conflict. And what the UN called the Pacific Settlement of Disputes is something we believe very strongly in. Because I think what we've experienced in our own region is that you can have conflict, you can have military solutions, very strong military solutions, spend $3 trillion on that military solution, and then go for a negotiated 2020, whether you call it a withdrawal agreement or a peace agreement or whatever nomenclature you decide to use it, after 20 years of perpetuating warfare. Okay, so that's a lesson that we can't afford to unlearn. And that's a lesson that we've learned that we must be able to apply, or at least give good advice to whoever might be in the mood to listen. And then humanitarian relief efforts for civilians affected by conflict must continue, is our view. But let me also say, as someone who has looked after Pakistan's aid management portfolio, as someone who looked after, for instance, was in the humanitarian appeal, flash appeal of the earthquake of 2005. Yes, I am that old, meaning I remember all of those times. And then the 2010 flash appeal for the floods happened to be there at that time also. Now, we know through all of that when conflict happens and when a disaster happens, no matter how much humanitarian and other assistance you give to those people, you cannot build back lives. Okay, so earthquakes, floods, not in our control. Conflict, in our control. Do we want to destroy lives? Then we want to spend money on building back those lives and feel great about it? Not a good idea. So then we come to now the direct impact of Ukraine-Russia crisis. And as I said, Ambassador Jalil, Foreign Secretary Jalil has already gone into the economic impact of it. I'm just going to say that 2 years back, if somebody would have told that a conflict in Europe could have an impact on Pakistan's fiscal space by 20 to 30 to, percent, and I would say, are you kidding me? Impossible to happen. Conflict in Europe, how does that translate? And this is what the world has become. This is what the world is. That conflict has had a huge impact on our fiscal space. It's taken all of our numbers, throw them out the door, and have to rebuild the budget. Okay? And unexpected, perhaps in many ways unprecedented for a conflict which is not really in your region to have that type of an impact, but also to me, a very big sign of another, so another underlying repercussion of the decisions that we make. Because I think this decision, the conflict had an impact, but then how the world decided to react to that conflict in terms of going towards sanctions and closing doors, etc., also had an impact on what the oil prices are right now. The oil prices are what they are not only because 10% of world's oil has been taken off the market, meaning is in a conflict zone, but it is because how the world reacted to that 10% of oil and the sanctions and the pressure that was put on whether to take or not. And do not forget that already before that we have another sanction regime which has taken 4% of the oil off the market, so to speak, also. So I tend to then think, when you look at things like this, and to be so generous in the use of sanctions, that are we running into another problem all over again? Because it is my belief that the interventions of the past were never thought through. It is my belief that we never like to look back as to the cost of the decisions that we make and do any analysis as to what has been the real cost. So there's a stated objective, what we want to achieve, build back better, national unity, national rebuilding, making a Switzerland out of, wherever. And then once we're done with that project and move on to the next project, we never have time to look back and say, what did we actually create or what did we? Now, luckily, for the same institutions also give us systems or institutions which tell us something. I'm terribly fond of this study called the Cost of War study, which is the Watson Institute of the Brown University, which is perhaps the only study that could appease my appetite for getting numbers, getting reality. Okay, what happened? How much was spent? What came out of it? Okay, and that study tells you something to the tune of the fact that post 9/11, 926,000 people were dead in post 9/11 wars that were conducted. It tells you that about 32 million people were displaced in the post 9/11 wars that were conducted. It tells you that about 8 trillion perhaps, but only on this. The numbers are huge. It also tells you that a lot of this spending also goes into the private sector defense spending, contracts and all of that. But that might not be relevant to what we're talking about. But what I'm saying is that we know now, thanks to that study at least, and we know also, by the way, Segar, who did a great work, the Special Inspector General of Afghanistan Reconstruction, who has consistently, again, the system itself, the US system itself throws back these great institutions. Great work on how the money was spent, on the development side, how it was perhaps not as useful, how there were so many various elements. So luckily we have some evidence on how the interventions went in real numbers. Where are the numbers on what is the cost of these sanctions that we have so happily, callously, casually been putting in, and what is the cost to the ordinary people? And are the ordinary people in Iran or Russia or Ukraine the targets for our sanctions? And if they're not, and if they are the primary targets, and if the sanctions end up only targeting them, do you think there is room to, or perhaps reason to relook at the policy framework or the policies that we follow? So these are interesting side questions that arise when we make these, big when we take these strong positions, big positions, which we sometimes don't have the ability to hold. Because we saw that many of the positions, and we can't, as I said, I think as a country we can't unlearn the lessons, because we know now that many of the positions that were taken in Afghanistan were not sustainable, were not tenable, did not hold. So we had one president coming and telling us, and that girls going to school is the most important thing, and then we had 2 terms later another president saying that they're not here to send girls to school, right? And we were to believe that, and we were to believe this. So the point of all of this is that it's very important to think through, to look at the day after, and to look at plan B, and to look at all of that. And within this conflict, I think our concerns are that, again, we are taking some positions, some strategic positions, which may be difficult to walk back from, but will have repercussions and ramifications, which will this time not only change the complexion and the, this region, but the whole world, as it seems. Because as countries which were told this is all a global village, bring down your trade barriers, now we're told, oh no, be careful about your supply chains. We are no more living in a global village. Were we being told the truth then, or are we being told the truth now? Are we supposed to decide for ourselves? Do we have this? So it's all very interesting how the world is working. Now, within the political insecurity, I will just share with you that it is remarkable how the world can change within just 2 years. Okay, so I look at Munich 2020 actually, because this is February 2020, just before the world closed down on COVID, because of COVID, and at that time everybody was talking about the Chinese delegation and how we were so generous to let them in, not knowing that everybody was be closing down very soon. And we were, and at that time I remember we were talking, there was talk about brain dead NATO, there was talk about Europe's strategic autonomy by Macron. I went to that forum and I came back thinking the world is changing in a very big way, and this NATO cross-Atlantic, it's perhaps dying down if not dead. And then Munich 2022, okay? And it seems like the brain dead has been resurrected in a way that could have been unimaginable 2 years back, right? And some people may argue that this may be the biggest gift that the conflict in Russia has given to NATO. It has revived, revitalized, resurrected, whatever nomenclature you want to use. But that's the reality right now. That is the reality that is there. So you have that. And what do you see more interestingly is departure from many of the things which were pushed. Departure from many of the. So today what we're celebrating is military spending. we're celebrating military spending of every country, and that has suddenly become in vogue again. I thought, 10 years back or so, we were saying stop military spending and let's go towards education, health, etc. We see that the planet is being faced by its biggest threat. Climate change is no more a threat for the future. It is a threat in our face, affecting our crops, affecting our lives, affecting our weather cycle, affecting our climate. It's staring us in the face. And we actually don't feel we have the need to really coalesce our energies, minds together to be able to deal. I mean, single-mindedly, if the world was to stop everything else and to just deal with the climate crisis, we would still not have it in us. Going at the rate that we're going, we're looking at climate overshoot right now. We're not looking at mitigation only. So that in itself. Then, of course, the other threat that has emanated is the food security problem. Again, are we really doing whatever is in our power to be able to deal with that threat, or are we doing whatever is in our power to create that threat even more? So these are interesting questions, and I think the answer is that the world is in a little bit of a disarray right now. So as we move away from one structure, we don't know which other structure we're moving towards. We're breaking a lot of things, but we're not building, anything in return. And in all of this, what comes out of it remains to be seen. So in these circumstances, and sorry for this long soliloquy, but the idea is that in these circumstances, with these set of realities, with these set of changing realities, where everything that we talk to be the gospel truth has been challenged by the propagators of the gospel truth itself. So where we are right now, what do we do? And I think it can be broken down into really simple language and simple choices. I want to first of all say that any insinuation in an environment like this from domestic observers, from anywhere else about the erosion of the country's sovereignty is a myth that is only propagated for reasons which are not very country specific, which are not for the country, which might be for individuals. I say this because every country, it is my firm belief, and I would not be able to say it had I not spent the 2010-13 time in Foreign Office as the Foreign Minister and spending this time now, that every country is actually sovereign. Every country always does make its own. Yes, there are always pressures, and currently the level of pressures on every country from many countries is immense. Pakistan is not the only one. Now, you make your choices, whether to give in to any type of pressure or to take the pressure which is good for your country and to reject the one which is bad for your country. So so let's be able to make that demarcation. And the only constricting forces in a sovereign's decision are two: the reality of its geography, the interests of its people. And I'm not even saying the interests of the country, because sometimes that is misconstrued and misinterpreted to be some grand strategic designs of the country. Yeah? It's the interest of a country are converted directly or translated directly only to be seen from the framework of the interest of the people. If your foreign policy is opening doors for the people of Pakistan, for trade and investment from Pakistan, you are doing a good job. If it is closing doors for the people of Pakistan, for trade from Pakistan, for investments for Pakistan, you are perhaps need to relook at what you're doing. Okay, so grand posturing is great, but grand posturing has to mean real advantages for the people, therefore, allow me to just enumerate very quickly 4 or 5 principles that what are Pakistan's imperatives and what does Pakistan not want to be sucked into. We are clearly not wanting to be sucked into any great power rivalry. I strongly feel we have the ability, right now at least, I don't know what tomorrow is going to hold for us, to be able to maneuver around that balancing act by having deep, honest conversations behind closed doors and keeping our mouth, keeping as quiet as is possible. I have learned, Riaz, over time, that good diplomacy is to speak less rather than to speak more. Okay, so we can speak about general ideas, but I said this to her or him, and I said that to her and him, never does good for the country. It's better to say what you need to say behind closed doors, but to try and be, to try and be a little bit less sort of vocal about it. in vitiated global environment, principles and fairness usually are the first casualties, okay? So we will all talk about I sometimes say to people who say, oh, we are saying this, but they're saying this, who are you choosing? And I say, you know what? Both of your stated positions is exactly the same. Okay, you talk about universality of human rights, having no exceptions, rules-based system. Well, guess what? What you consider to be our adversary? It's exactly the same language. So we are with what both of you are saying. You know, we are with those value systems. So we already see we have already seen how politics and self-interest have become the guiding features of application of sanctions. I have already talked a great deal about it. I don't want to talk more about it, but it is all very selective. Okay, so because I have known human rights abuse in my region, which have not been taken as seriously. So when we speak about human rights and about our value system and about our being propagators and promoters of that, I want to be convinced that it is universal in nature. If I'm convinced it is universal in nature, I'm with you. If you apply with the same tenacity, force, vigor, your value system when it is abused somewhere else, which may be far off from your land and not on your strategic landscape, I am then going to be as convinced that it is my job to defend when it is in your, when it is not in my strategic landscape, but is in your strategic landscape. I feel obliged to do the same. Now, so obviously, as I said, every country experiences pushes and pulls. And to say, oh, what happened? They're saying there's no pressure. Hey, that's part of their job, right? I mean, that's what it happens in the world. Everybody, we like to put pressure. We put a lot of pressure on people. They decide to resist it sometimes. Sometimes they decide to give in. That's our job. We will try and put pressure for the interest of Pakistan. What I consider to be the interest of Pakistan today, I will put whatever pressure is in my power, in my toolkit, on any country to do what I consider to be in Pakistan's interest. So why should I judge anyone else trying to put pressure on? I will judge myself if I cave into that pressure, which is against the interest of the people of Pakistan. It's as simple as that. So really, I've just tried to enumerate, in a simplistic manner, what we consider to be. And I just want to end by, once again, saying that I think if there's one lesson that has been learned is, and if the world decides not to learn that lesson, I think we don't have the luxury to unlearn that lesson or to not feel the weight of that lesson. And that lesson is the repercussions and ramifications of policy decisions that are taken within the strategic realm, which are very forcefully articulated, even more forcefully implemented, but then the leaf, the page turns and you go on to the next conflict. But you leave the debris of this conflict for someone to handle. Someone, some countries, some individuals can never recover from that. And that's the big lesson, I think, that we've learned.
Thank you so much, Minister, for your splendid remarks, keynote address. You have raised some very important, you have covered almost every issue related to this important subject, which is the focus of today's seminar. You have reiterated Pakistan's policy of neutrality in this conflict. You have rightly pointed out that war is not in anybody's interest. And you have also absolutely right that principled policy decisions of the past are being replaced by a different narrative. And the debris that we created during the past conflicts, you left it for others to clear. Ladies and gentlemen, the minister has other important commitments, so she will not be able to stay here. Thank you so much, Minister, for your presence and for your keynote address. I fully endorse the remarks of former Foreign Secretary Riaz Khokhar Saab that you are certainly a gem and you have served the country very well. We feel proud of you. Both in your private capacity and your official capacity, you have really served the country well. Thank you so much for your presence. I would myself and President would see off the minister, but before that President will present a memento without. In the meanwhile, I would request the honorable members of the panel to take their seats on the stage. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, the Minister set the tone for this very important topic that we are going to discuss. And we are fortunate to have a panel which can easily be termed as a dream panel for any seminar. We are extremely grateful to Ambassador Riaz Khokhar Sahab, former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan, General Aamer Riaz, former President, National Defense University, Squadron Leader Farhat Masood, and Dr. Usman Chohan, Director, CAS, as members of this panel. Ambassador Riaz Khokhar Sahab, former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan, needs no introduction. He is someone who is a role model for the entire Foreign Service. The foreign policy and the security establishment, they have always sought his views on important foreign policy issues. And he is very well respected, not only within the country, but internationally as well, for his thorough professionalism, his integrity, deep knowledge of the regional and global issues. And he's a great disciplinarian as well. I am very, very fortunate again that I worked very, very closely with Foreign Secretary Riaz Khokhar Sahab when he was the Foreign Secretary, and also earlier in the Prime Minister's office. And to be very honest, I owe a debt of gratitude to Riaz Khokhar Sahab, because whatever I am today, or whatever I was able to achieve in the Foreign Service of Pakistan, it was all due to his guidance and his coaching that he gave all of us. He taught us hard work, commitment, truthfulness, honesty, and integrity, which are important traits for any civil servant who has the interest of the country before him. Riaz Khokhar Sahab will be the first speaker. He will speak on the impact of Ukrainian crisis on global order, South Asia, and Pakistan. Sir, may I request you for your remarks? Sorry.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. First of all, I wish to thank Air Marshal Farhat Hussain Khan for his gracious invitation to this very important seminar. I thank my very dear friend and colleague, Jalil, for his gracious comments. Actually, to be fair, I learned more from my colleagues than I could educate them myself. So I've always been a great supporter of seeking advice from one's colleagues. I'm very happy that I'm sharing a panel with a general or generals. And also, sorry, please pardon, is it Dr. Chohan? Dr. Chohan. Now, I'm used to speaking a little frankly. And that's why I'm not invited very often. I want to give few preliminary remarks and very short ones, and thereafter I'll get on to the subject. As a student, I was always told that you must study the map. And quite honestly, I learned a lot by looking at a map. Some of the most brilliant strategists in the world, such as Alfred Mahan, Sir Harold Mackinder, Spikeman, Brzezinski, and Dr. Kissinger. I'm sure there are many others. The list is very long. Some are Russians, some are Chinese, and Chinese names are not easy to pronounce, as you know. I believe, and I think very rightly so, Mr. Brzezinski said about Eurasia, he said that this is the world's Axel supercontinent. And whoever controls that will control the rest of the world. And this is actually built on what Sir Harold Mackinder had said in 1905. And I honestly recommend that anybody who's interested in strategy should read this particular lecture. So, for us it is very critical, because we are not very far from it. The only country in between us and Central Asia is Afghanistan. The second point I want to make is that Soviet Union broke up for the following reasons. Number one, overextended. Number two, it had been eaten by termites for its economic capacity. And a lot of oligarchs robbed the Soviet Union during this period of Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Thirdly, a very important reason I would say is why Soviet Union collapsed. It was not a country. It was an empire which was holding lots of other countries by sheer force. So there was no glue to keep it together. Well, during the period of Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and I think this is a lesson for Pakistan, it went through an extremely difficult period. The whole thing about Ukraine starts from the understanding that the US Secretary of State, Baker, had given to Gorbachev, and of course subsequently, Gorbachev particularly, that you withdraw your soldiers from Germany, all your soldiers, and allow the unification of Germany, and we will ensure that we will not move an inch forward east. Now, of course, this was not in writing, but I recommend two books that are absolutely outstanding about Cold War situation. One is written by a man called Melvin Leifer. It's 600 pages. And the other one is written by a gentleman by the name of, I can't read his name. Melvin Leifer, and anyway, let's forget that second name. The third thing I would recommend is that please listen to a program done by John Maishma, who is one of the most respected professors and commentator on the Cold War issue and otherwise also. Now, I must relate this little thing. Jalil, I have your permission. I accompanied President Musharraf in 2004 for a meeting with President Putin. And it was an hour and 20-minute meeting, which was formal. And then we spent 2 hours informally. He did not give a banquet for the president, but we had this conversation in his private apartment in the Kremlin, which was very Spartan. I mean, a lot of people think that Kremlin, you know, of course the formal area is palatial, but a very Spartan apartment. And we had an excellent conversation. He went over this thing. He is on record and publicly known that he described the breakup of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. And he explained this to us as well, and I don't want to go into too many details, but what he emphasized is that the period Gorbachev to his time, Soviet Union, or rather Russia, was humiliated. Gorbachev and Yeltsin had to beg the United States to get them loans, etc., from IMF. They neither got the loans that they wanted, neither did they get the investments that they asked for. So there is this background to all things. Now, I'm not trying to be an apologist for Putin. There is no doubt that he has invaded Ukraine. And there is a history. There is reason. We must try and understand why Ukraine is critical for Russia. The 2 major invasions over the years that Russia had suffered, one was, of course, the time of Napoleon, and Napoleon was stopped. And the second was the Second World War invasion of the Nazis, in which the Soviet Union lost 27 million. That's the population of at least 4 or 5 European countries. So this is behind. So Russians are, you know, they have a psychosis for this thing, and they are paranoid about their security. Now, today, now I'm coming to the current point. Today, we know what happened in Madrid only 2 or 3 days ago. A statement was issued, and a strategic charter has been designed. So what is the United States policy today? US policy today is that it does not want a challenger, either in Europe or in the Indo-Pacific. It is, shall we say, deeply committed that there will be no challenger to the United States' preeminence as a superpower. So this is one of the basic elements about the world order. The world order is already in disorder, or shall we say, in a tailspin. But I think the invasion of Ukraine has now put it on the screen for the entire world. So it is very important to know the background. And John Meschmeyer, I think the lecture is 21st June 2002, please listen to it, has done a superb job in examining the reasons for the invasion of Ukraine. Now, Putin is not a fool, and he didn't go mad. He is one of the sharpest, shall we say, leaders in the world when it comes to the security of its country. I just want to say that, I mean, nobody can justify an invasion. And usually invasions are done by great powers or major powers, and small countries are invaded. And I think this is an example. And Ukraine is not a small country. It's after Russia, it's the second largest country in Europe, and a country with great resources and virtually a granary for the rest of the world, and a granary particularly for Africa and for the Middle East, and of course other countries. So he has examined very carefully and said that, yes, he made a mistake, or shall we say, let's hold him responsible for invading Ukraine, but at the same time, let's examine the circumstances that were created for the invasion of Ukraine. Since 2008, when he was invited to the Bucharest summit by NATO, he has been warning the world. They had already admitted a number of East European countries into NATO, and the two exceptions were Georgia and Ukraine. Georgia was within 2 months of the summit. Georgia was invaded, and then, of course, now Ukraine. Now, what are the challenges? I mean, that is the question that I'm supposed to be dealing with. Enormous challenges. First of all, the first challenge is, how do we bring about peace? And people have talked about neutrality. Neutrality has now become a bad word. So let's say non-alignment, or find some other word for it. So I believe, and I think there is a lot of belief in the world, that some kind of a solution has to be found where Russia is assured that Ukraine would not become a member of NATO. It can join European Union if it wants to, but not a member of, so that the deployment of American forces or American missiles or American top rate equipment is not on the borders of Russia. That is the key to the whole thing. And now, unfortunately, there aren't really world-class statesmen in the world. The only one that I thought who could bring about some kind of a settlement was Chancellor Merkel, who had an equation and an understanding with President Putin. Surely attempts have to be made. Second thing that I wish to underline is that the United Nations, which has been given the responsibility for peace and security, etc., is emasculated. Secretary General, one feels sorry for him. He's not in a position to do anything. So that's the second part. Thirdly, the question of US-Russian relations. I don't see any prospects of any improvement in the near future. Today, what has happened is that you have 30 or 32 countries led by the United States against Russia. So Europe is going to face very critical situation. And Europe itself is suffering, not only the economic aspects, because they were heavily dependent on Russia for gas and for oil and for other things. And of course, similarly, Russia itself is going to suffer heavily because, you know, all this gas and oil that they were selling to them has to find some other sources. Ukraine is devastated. According to the World Bank, the losses are already worth 100 billion. And if and when the war stops, and if and when there is sort of peace, the reconstruction of Ukraine will cost the world $1 trillion. Now, Meshmar's point is valid, that United States and European countries are supplying arms to Ukraine to continue the struggle. And quite frankly, people of Ukraine deserve a compliment for having faced the Russians. I mean, it's like 10 to 1. And they've shown that how it is important to defend every inch of your country. It's not a question of, you know, the grass doesn't grow in this area and therefore we don't have to do anything about it. The main thing is that they have defended their country like nothing else. And I think they deserve a handsome tribute. Other question is, what is the impact? And I don't see, as I said, no, I don't see any Russian-American relationship improving in the near future, or perhaps even for maybe even a decade or so. It'll take a long time unless Putin, leaves the government, or there is a regime change. Because, you know, United States has been asking about regime change in Russia, regime change in China, regime change elsewhere. So these things have been happening, and United States is capable of doing these kind of things. The question now, important question now is, what will be the nature of relationship between Russia and China? Now, China has talked about no limits to this relationship, and nothing is off the table. But the country that is watching this war is China, because they are also learning a lot. They didn't expect that the Russian army would not be able to perform the way it has. I think this is one of, and I'm in no position to talk about military matters. We have an outstanding general here who can tell us more about it. So the Chinese are watching this thing very carefully. Chinese are very smart people, and backed by 5,000 years of history and 5,000 years of understanding of strategic issues. You know, there are two games. One is chess, which the Russians play, and the other is called Go, which is the game that the Chinese play. And Go has more strategic moves than chess. So how far is China willing to go with the Russians? To begin with, they are buying a lot of oil from them at a very cheap thing. Also, maybe while the Russians at the moment don't need any financial assistance from China, because Russia has a reserves of $640 billion plus they haven't really suffered at the moment. But in the long term, 44 countries have sanctioned the Russians. So at some stage or the other, there will be an impact on the Russians as far as the economy is concerned. The third country, that is, the second country that is also watching developments with great interest is India. Despite all the pressures from the United States and European countries, it took an independent line and took a non-aligned view of the situation, did not condemn Russia, spoke in similar terms like we did at the United Nations, talking about principles and so on and so forth. But please don't forget, India is a predator on the border of Pakistan. Our borders are disputed, whether it's Azad Kashmir or in Gilgit-Baltistan. And on the other side, on the western side, also we have an issue. Afghanistan disputes the Durand Line. It's very interesting that I'm not an admirer of General Ziaul Haq, but I must say to his credit that he had some strategic sense. Brzezinski in 1978 or 78 had a dinner meeting with Ziaul Haq here and assured Ziaul Haq that we will not allow the Russians to cross the Durand Line. Now, Americans in their own mind had already made that calculation. So President Zia, with his usual chuckle, he had this very strange chuckle. He turned to Brzezinski and said to him, "Thank you very much for your support, but we want to stop the Russians at Amur." Now, I think I give him credit for that kind of strategic understanding. The question now before the world is, we see containment everywhere. In the Pacific, Indo-Pacific, as it has been specially named after conversations with India, there are lots of hotspots. And the United States has an alliance system which it has strengthened. United States has been able to rope in India, whether they turn out to be reliable allies or not is another matter, but containment is here to stay. So when people say the Cold War, in my opinion, the first Cold War round was actually a picnic, because there was really no direct engagement between either Russia or between the Soviet Union and the United States. The only exceptions were where they were close to an engagement was Cuba, and earlier on the Berlin airlift, if you recall, and then there were some situations where things were a little tricky, but they never fired at each other. I mean, this is the best part of the first. But now the new Cold War is what you call a great game, which is going to be very complicated. So Indo-Pacific, United States has got 800 bases all over the world, a budget of $850 billion, an alliance system in which they are roping in more countries, and India has joined this what you call Quad 1 and AUKUS. That's the situation there. In Europe, now there is a new Iron Curtain that, in my opinion, has descended between Ukraine and Russia. The question is, will Russia return Ukraine's territory or not? Because it has taken, the Donbass area and Crimea and so on and so forth. It seems to me that they won't, because they consider this as a cordon sanitaire against the United States, etc. The US approach is very interesting. They think that this is the time to stop the rise, or shall we say, the further reassertion of Russia and the rise of China. And since they are going to be allies and friends or whatever, we really don't know the nature of relationship between Russia and China as of now. But as I said, that I'm sure there's a lot of thinking going on in Beijing, and there's a lot of thinking going on in Moscow on how they are going to be dealing with the United States. So the world order is in disorder, in a flux, and the contours of the future world order are certainly not clear at the moment. I mean, we don't know which way the cat's going to jump. The prospects of Cold War getting worse and deeper are there, and whether this Cold War will translate it into some kind of hot war either in the Indo-Pacific or in Europe. I think this is, in a nutshell, the view. Finally, I want to talk about India and Pakistan. Now, let us say, for argument's sake, that Russia believes in Akhand Russia, because a lot of people accuse Russia of wanting to reimpose or recollect or reconstruct the past empire. I don't think they can do it, and I don't think they have the ability and the capacity and the capability. Now, if Russia really wanted to, shall we say, conquer Ukraine, then a deployment of 185,000 troops is chicken feed. Yeah. It's a very vast country. So obviously he had in mind that he will be taking away what he considers best. When I said Russia, Akhand, I also have Bharat Akhand in mind. Now, maybe in the past, a lot of people didn't think about these issues. But please don't close the chapter. But because today you have a regime in India that is deeply committed, is a supremacist, and believes in Hindutva, and they're already talking about Ghar Wapsi and this and that, and Akhand Bharat extends from here to there. So those who are responsible for our national security, our, shall we say, security in a kind of a global sense, have to keep this in mind. My reading about the situation between India and Pakistan is not that there will be peace between the two countries. Unless we dump Kashmir, unless we say, all right, we are ready to accept your sort of hegemony, which the United States wants. United States wants Pakistan to accept Indian role in the region and allow India to contribute to the containment of China. This is really a nightmare thing for us. So we are at a very complex situation. Pakistan-Chinese relations are very strategic in nature and all that. I don't have to go into details. But both India and the United States wants some clipping of this relationship, and certainly about CPEC. So allow me to end here, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions. Sorry, Jalil, I may have taken...
So much, sir, for your elaborate remarks. Excellent points raised by you. Our, ladies and gentlemen, second esteemed speaker is General Aamer Riaz, a soldier, a thinker, and a good human being. Besides a deep knowledge of the military matters, military strategy, he also has got a deep knowledge and understanding of the regional and global issues. My first interaction with General Aamer Riaz took place when I was Foreign Secretary and he was Director General Military Operations. And from the first day, we hit it off very well. And I was thoroughly impressed by his professionalism, his integrity, and the way he kind of discharged his responsibilities in various assignments which were given to him, whether head of the Western Command in Quetta, whether Corps Commander Lahore, or President National Defense University. General Aamer Riaz will enlighten us with his views on the land war strategy being employed by Russia-Ukraine, and with the help of course, Ukraine is being helped by the US, NATO, and the European countries. So the floor is yours, sir. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at such a wonderful forum and in front of such a wonderful gathering of friends. It is not easy to talk about a war which is still happening. I think it is visible, the slide is visible. I'm not going to use any more slides because I just wanted to use one slide so that everybody knows what is the situation on the ground at the moment, since I've been asked to deal with the situation on the ground. But let me make first some admissions. The first admission is that I have not visited the ops room in Kremlin. I have not been to Kiev, and I have not been to their ops room. So what I'm going to present is mostly drawn from the sources that are available, open sources, and try and make some sense out of how the land war or the war itself has gone on till this day, and how is it likely to pan out in the future. The strategic situation or the backgrounder has been very well set by none less than the former Secretary Khokhar Saab, and I cannot talk about it anymore, but just recapitulating few things, it may be at the cost of some repetition, but it is important. The most important event since in the 20th century, I think Putin was right, and so many other strategists are right in this. That was the breakup of the Soviet Union. The world has not recovered from that shock so far. And then there was a clear understanding. Some say it was a general understanding, but there was a clear understanding. And I'm also not I'm not going to be presenting Putin's point of view, but this is the point of view which is embedded in cold history. There was a clear understanding at the breakup of the Soviet Union that NATO, when Germany will reintegrate, NATO will not move 1 inch eastwards. And I've had the opportunity, I'll narrate a couple of incidents to you. A few years back, I was in the capacity of President NDU, I was visiting Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's a very critical state. In the last map you saw it, it's somewhere there close to. You have Serbia on the east, and you have Bosnia-Herzegovina on the west, and this is ex-Yugoslavia. This is a very critical space in the Balkans. And there was a conversation. This is an interesting country. It has 3 presidents. We can't handle one, they had 3 presidents. So they have 3 presidents, and no decision can be made without consensus of the 3 communities led by 3 presidents. There are Serbs, there are Croats, and there are Bosniaks. And it was very strange that they ushered us into a conversation where all 3, there was a foreign minister, there was a defense minister, and there was a deputy defense minister, they were sitting. They asked us to attend that meeting, and we were part of that meeting, and the discussion was, should we join NATO or should we not join NATO? Anyway, they had their own views. We were not there to give them any suggestions. But unfortunately, as the things panned out, they asked for our suggestion. So what do you think about it from an objective, far removed point of view? How do you think about the situation? We have a long-standing relationship with Bosnians. So we suggested to them that it is a very, you have to take this decision very carefully. You may have some friends also, but you may have some very sharp enemies as well. Now you are in a position where you can have friends on both sides, but then you will be part of a military alliance against another state which has deep interests in your area. You have to make this choice yourselves. It's a difficult choice. Joining NATO, you will have clearly enemies and you will have some friends. So it's a choice that you have to make. We, 2013, I was at a conference in Moscow, Valdai Club, and the conversation was again on NATO's expansion eastwards and how does actually the conference was about Afghanistan, but it eventually got to the heartland, as they call it. Heartland is an interesting theory. It does not start in the Central Europe, it starts from Eastern Europe and it ends close to further northwest of our borders. This is the heartland. So the Russians were talking about the heartland, and this expansion of the NATO into the heartland poses a direct threat to the Russian interests and vulnerabilities, and the psychosis is very clear. It runs in history. It is not only Napoleon, it is even before that Once Crimea was taken by the Ottomans, they used to feel threatened, and they had to move their capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg and developed a new city which is much north. So there is an issue with the Russian psyche on this. So give it to them. They waited for too long. They tried to convince the people, but in the meanwhile, they were preparing. They were definitely preparing for this day to come. And NATO expanded eastwards. I know for sure that in last 10 years or so, the American view of the Central and the Western European NATO allies was not very good. They were looking to have more and more eastward placed allies in Romania, in Hungary, in Poland, in Czech Republic, and so on and so forth. So they moved eastwards. Anyways, the Russians also gradually recovered. There was a huge economic political turmoil once Soviet Union broke down, and we all know it. I don't want to talk about it. He did. The Russians gradually recovered. In 2019, I went to Russia again, and I could see a sense of confidence over there. We did talk about that if you get into a conflict, there'll be sanctions, there'll be problems. They did Crimea by then. 2014, Crimea had happened. And the West had sort of absorbed it, taken it, and all that. And there are good reasons for that. Then the Russians were preparing for last about 10 years for this day to come. And they were preparing to deal with the sanctions. They were preparing to deal with what kind of difficulties that they will endure. Nobody can be fully prepared, but they did prepare for this. They prepared their agriculture also. Somebody talked about agriculture in the morning, food security. They prepared for that also. They brought their gas and oil infrastructure to a different level. They developed a relationship with the Central Western Europeans by supplying more and more energy to them cheaper. Nobody can supply that kind of energy to Europeans at that rate. This is a done deal. Not the Kuwaitis, not the Qataris, not the Iranians will do it. It will be more expensive. It takes a long distance to reach there. So the Russians were preparing. There was a continuity of leadership. Putin was there, one position or the other, and finally as set as the president, perhaps for the lifetime, but who knows. So there was a continuity of leadership, there was continuity of strategy, there was continuity of preparation. It was happening. After their economic recovery, they adopted a complete rejuvenation plan for their military and their nuclear arsenal. Military for the conventional game, and nuclear arsenal, which they have upgraded immensely in the last 5 years or so, is to keep everybody away from the conventional conflicts that the Russians are going to fight. And they have so far done it relatively effectively. There is deterrence which is there in place. The Western forces will not intervene directly into Ukraine. They have made it very clear that they will not do it. They're sending weapons and others, which is only prolonging the war. Obviously, it has its own effects. We'll talk about it a little later. Then once this was done, then there was a gradual reassertion of the Russians. I'm also reminded of a conversation. The Secretary of Defense, United States, was here back in 2013, and that they were planning an intervention in Syria. And we were having a conversation basically on Afghanistan, that's our primary concern. Obviously, Middle East is also our serious concern. We were having a conversation with him when he first told us that there is some kind of a maneuver in place, and they have moved their forces close to Syria and the sea, and there'll be perhaps an intervention against a non-democratic dictatorial government of Assad. And there was a view that we had put up to them that the Russians will get involved. And once the Russians get involved, the political solution to Syria will become impossible. There'll be so many other people who will get involved. The Russians did take advantage of that. They went into Crimea a year later. They intervened in Syria. But they very carefully did not intervene in Afghanistan physically. Anyway, then there was another event which took place, it was very important, and that is denuclearization of Ukraine. Many keep questioning here in Pakistan, your security is your responsibility first. Denuclearization of Ukraine took place. It was the 5th largest nuclear armed country in the world in the early 90s. Its denuclearization took place on the guarantees given by the Russians and the Americans. And its nuclear weapons were taken away. They were the Soviet time nuclear weapons, but they were placed, they were there. The Ukrainians had the infrastructure, the Ukrainians had the command and control systems to take care of the nuclear weapons, but they gave them away. And then obviously the rise of China, which has been elaborated at quite a length. Now there is a problem. The problem is that the US power has reached a peak point, and it is receding. Having reached the peak point, it has started to recede, and the challenges, the most important challenge, obviously China, they are on the rise. I'm not saying that the recession of power will take US down, or it is the rise of China which may eventually in a decade or two match or even overtake the American power. Myself and Ambassador, former Secretary, Foreign Secretary Jilani Sahab, my dear friend, we were together at Shangri-La Dialogue about 2-3 weeks back. And the Chinese Defense Minister made a very profound statement, and this is after when the Americans had spoken. The American Defense Secretary spoke, and he said that we are the largest deployment in Asia Pacific. I choose to call it Asia Pacific, because this was Asia Pacific. It has been recently renamed by the Americans as Indo-Pacific to keep the Indians on board. So he said that we have the largest deployment, 300,000 American troops are deployed in this region, and we have close allies and this and that. And we believe in the rules-based world, and anybody who breaks the rules, we should be in a position to respond by all means. When they say all means, that includes diplomatic, economic, political, and military means. The next day, the Chinese defense minister spoke. Some of you must have heard him, some of you may not have. He made it very clear that we believe in peace and development of the region altogether, but if somebody eggs on Taiwan and tries to change the status unilaterally, they said, before that he said that it's only a province of China. It's waiting to get integrated. We are trying to do it peacefully. It'll happen. And anybody who tries to change this status quo, we will attack. Period. We will go to war. We will take it by force. And anybody who intervenes, regardless of which power it is, we'll fight to the end. Quote unquote. So the world is changing. The world has changed. So this is where we are. And I think the Russians are also reading it like the Americans, that this is the chance, and they have to do it. And it was a very serious security concern that they had. So their political objectives, now coming in the way the military presents itself, the political objectives could be simple and straight: address growing vulnerability of Russia. This is point number one. To do what? To stop NATO's expansion, and by implication give a strong message to all frontier countries who harbor such kind of hopes to be part of NATO. They should think not twice, thrice before taking this decision. Overthrow the Western-leaning government in Ukraine. That may happen, that may not happen. It doesn't look likely at this point in time. This is important, I think, maybe you alluded to this. Absorb the Russian-speaking areas, and perhaps on a permanent basis. I don't think the Russians are going to give up those areas back to Ukraine. And therefore, their land maneuver is configured in a certain way, and I'm going to talk about it in short. So what could be their military objectives? They've gone into Donbass, they've gone into Luhansk. These are the areas that you're looking at. They're already there in Crimea, and they have created a land route to Crimea very clear. These are all ethnic Russian-speaking areas. So military objectives were simple: capture and absorb Luhansk and Donbass, and the battle is going on there. By the way, about 7 to 8% of Ukrainian territory has been lost, and Ukraine is a country bigger than Pakistan in size. It's a very large European, second largest European country. When we say 8% of its territory, means an area close to entire Pakistani Punjab has been lost. It's not an easy deal, but it's taken about 4 months. Second objective was to, do we have the pointer here? It is working? Yes. How? Yahan se? Sorry. Yahan se? How do this one? Okay. The second very important thing that you must have heard the name Kharkiv. Kharkiv actually provides very important lines of communication into Luhansk and Donbass area, and also provides lines of communication to Kyiv. This is a very crucial area where the battle is still going on. They have taken it. The Russians are now controlling the lines of communication into Donbass and this area. That was one of the main objectives that they had during the initial stages of the war, but the fight is still going on. Then was to open a ground link, a clear, definite ground link to Crimea. That has been done. Then was to keep control over sea and air lines of communication in the Black Sea. Black Sea is right, sorry. Can we go back to that? That's it. Black Sea is right here, this part. So they wanted to keep the lines of communication open. They also made a push to Odessa, which has not succeeded. Odessa is the main Ukrainian port, which is supplying Ukraine, and any supplies getting out and in of Ukraine. Which is why you heard the name of Snake Island. Snake Island is in the Black Sea. This is erstwhile Ukrainian territory. The Russians took it. The Russians have evacuated from this. It was untenable for them to stay there because it was, the military would understand this, it was in the direct artillery range of the Ukrainians, and they deployed so many pieces which came from Western Europe. This island is very small. The Russians could not hold it, and they have left it, which is a success for the Ukrainians. And then was degradation of the Ukrainian military and industrial infrastructure. And physically assist the insurgent forces which are fighting there since 2013-14 in the Russian-speaking areas, to assist them physically. Now that they move in, so now they may not be needed anymore. And then maintain, this is important, maintain a credible deterrence against NATO forces. And that is by nuclear posturing, which to a lesser degree they have already done, the Russians. Then how did the land maneuver panned out? If you recall, the first threatened Kyiv and Kharkiv at the same time, which is in the north. This is Kyiv. They moved in from Belarus. They did not get to Kyiv. They came close to Kyiv, but they stopped their push here. Now this could be conjecturing that either this directly wanted to Kyiv, hit the political capital, take it, overthrow the government, reinstall a government of their own choosing, and the rest of the things were easy. This is one way to look at it. The other way to look at it, that it was a diversionary maneuver to draw the Ukrainian forces from the south and the east to defend Ukraine, and then launch a major offensive in Donbass and Luhansk area and take them. And while the Russian forces were still on the move to the north and coming back, degrade them by using their air and non-contact systems. Non-contact systems are missiles. So Kyiv could have been a diversionary or an actual objective, but in my view, if this was the actual objective, the Russians would have still pushed on. They had the resources to do it. It would have been a bloody fight. It was a very bloody fight. The Ukrainians put up a very tough resistance, but they could have still taken it. They could have surrounded Kyiv by this time, and the situation would have been entirely different. But it would have led to a solution in which they would not have absorbed these territories yet, which are the Russian-speaking territories. And if the Russian-speaking territories are absorbed from an operational point of view, it is very difficult for any forces, if they are deployed, let's assume the time has come to that point that the Americans and the NATO forces assemble in Ukraine for an offensive maneuver against the Russians, which is highly unlikely, but assuming that to happen, it cannot happen with these areas gone to Russia. There cannot be an advance directly into Russia. It has to use an other country or a third country to do this. And that the most important country in that case is Belarus, and Belarus is on the Russian side. So this was happening in the northeast. Kharkiv was crucial, as I told you before. They had to take this because their main lines of communication into this area to sustain their forces, to sustain their logistics, was coming from Kharkiv. It is still coming from Kharkiv, which is why a lot of fight is taking place here. The Ukrainians are putting in their best forces to retake Kharkiv and cut the lines of communication, hence to make the sustainability of these forces untenable unless they are supplied from the sea route. So then the air and missile strikes, basically phase one was going on to degrade the critical infrastructure and forces and demoralize the Ukrainian people. And push towards Odessa. As I told you before, there was a push. You can see a little intrusion here. This was a push towards Odessa, which has failed so far. And Odessa is the key port for the Ukrainians to survive. Then is the phase two started, which started about end of March, early April. This is almost completed. They have taken Donbass and Luhansk, which are the areas visible to you at the moment in red. And the majority of these areas have been captured by the Russian forces. What were the Ukrainian strategy on the ground? It was to defend Kyiv and Kharkiv at all costs. They did one, they could not do the other. The battle is still on, it's not over. They have launched a counter. At the moment, there's a counteroffensive going on against Kharkiv, which is here. Kyiv, they have defended. The Russians have been pushed back. The Russians have abandoned that offensive. They are not going to restart that offensive anytime soon. But Kharkiv, the battle is going on. The Ukrainians lost it. Odessa, they didn't want to give it to the Russians. They have not given it to the Russians so far. They wanted to keep a lot of areas in Donbass and Luhansk. They have failed. City upon city has fallen with a lot of damage and destruction. And I tend to agree with him. Rebuilding of Ukraine is not about just money. It may be 1 trillion or 2 trillions, but rebuilding of the entire infrastructure, bringing back all those people, those who have now spread far and wide into Europe, as far as deep as London and Scotland, they have to come back and they have to start their life. It is going to be a decades-long game. And now this was their first objective, defend Kyiv and Kharkiv, and keep the critical lines of communication open to these areas from the Ukrainian side, and dislodge the Russian forces from Snake Island, which they finally did. So phase two was to delay, disorganize, and stretch the Russian forces, and then launch counteroffensives. I am not in a position to make a judgment call that as of now the Russian forces have been stretched. Russians have tremendous resources. They have used about 120,000 troops. They have used about 1,500 to 2,000 tanks. Some say about close to 3,000 tanks. I don't have the exact figures. The resources are from the West. And lots of Western weapons have gone in, and some very sophisticated weapons have gone into the Ukrainians. Ukrainians have a good military. We have a deep military relationship with them. Just to tell you, our main strike force comprise of Ukrainian tanks. So, the javelins, the anti-tank weapons that they've used, but these are defensive weapons. You can never be victorious in a defensive war. Eventually, you may be able to contain them, but you would have lost a lot of territory, you would have suffered a lot of degradation, and in my humble opinion, the war is being prolonged unnecessarily to a point where perhaps Ukraine is going to suffer a lot. The American strategists might be looking at degrading the Russian forces considerably, but it will not really make a strategic difference, because what is holding the NATO away is not the conventional forces of Russia. NATO has much superior conventional forces than the Russians at this point in time. Combined, they can outwit the Russians anytime. But it is the nuclear forces which are keeping the NATO and the Americans away, and the nuclear forces cannot be countered. It's too serious a risk. So therefore, this war is now prolonging at a very serious peril to a lot of countries, to a lot of people in Asia, in Africa, and in Central Europe and Western Europe. So, and how would Zelensky? We heard Zelensky speak also. Myself and Ambassador Jilani was there, so he spoke from an undisclosed location in Kyiv, and he gave about 40 minutes of his understanding of what has happened to his country. Of course, war is a bad thing, but please remember it's an existential reality of all human civilizations. It will happen. Regardless of the rules-based world, regardless of the human rights, regardless of whatever, because human beings have many shades. But war is an existential reality of all times. Human beings have spent 70% of their time in fighting wars. 5,000 saal se leke abhi tak, till date, they have spent about 70% of their time in war. It's unfortunate, but that's the instinct of human beings. And this instinct has not, should I say, softened up or become sophisticated with the passage. It has not. Only the means to fight wars have become sophisticated. I clamped down sanctions on Iran for 30 years is to punish the people of Iran. It's war. So anyway, time is running out. So quickly, last thing, how would they like to end the war? The Ukrainians, they would like to end the war at an acceptable political outcome, maintaining Ukraine's sovereignty. And that might be minus the decision to join NATO. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for a great presentation, and certainly it was highly educative for all of us. One felt, although you mentioned that you did not visit the war room, but it seemed as if you had some inkling of. Ladies and gentlemen, our third speaker is Dr. Usman Chohan, a star of the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. Dr. Chohan is an economist. He is amongst the top 10 business authors of the Special Science Network, and has already published 4 books at this very young age. And certainly he has a long way to go forward. He certainly, being an economist, he has he is very well aware of the economic issues, not confronting not only Pakistan but the entire region. His focus will be on the impact of this Ukrainian crisis on the overall economic scene, particularly with regard to the kind of economic woes that we are faced with. So, floor is yours, Dr. Usman. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. President Kass, esteemed panelists, and the diverse audience that we have, I'd like to recognize our visitors from fellow think tanks, from the NSD, serving and retired members of the Air Force, as well as the diplomatic community, and members of the general public who have graced us with their presence. I'm covering the economic dimensions of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I'd request that one of the cameras remain on the presentation rather than on my Hussain chehra, because that is less important. I have picked a specific image here. This is Vasily Petrovich Goloborodko, the character portrayed by Vladimir Zelensky in the show Sluga Narodu. And it is not just a very good representation of the challenge that he has faced, it is also a very good narrative portraying the challenges of governance and misgovernance in a society like ours. I learned more about my society watching this than I would from our media or from our narratives. But in addition, it is the best symbol of what we as a global community, as a world society, have to deal economically. कि जी फाइलें पढ़ी हैं, वो बाएं हाथ में उसने पकड़ी हुई हैं. हमें भी सारा डेटा है और अगर आपके पास नहीं है तो मैं आपको फरहमा भी करूंगा. लेकिन जी साइकिल टूटी पई दी है. The vehicle by which we can realize that economic attainment of stability and growth, or टूटी पई दी है, if you permit my colloquialism, sir. So, my presentation was intended to be slightly longer, but I request your patience because it is 2 presentations. I'll try to make it as engaging and lively as I can, even though I recognize that the subject is fundamentally quite dull. The first component is the economic fallout for the world as a whole, right? And that includes us. But I'll actually do that in the second part. And I'd instead prefer to take economics as warfare, the economic weapon, economic sanctions first. So this is 2 different presentations being done together. There is a lot of reading that is out there about economic warfare, the economic weapon. I have studied the subject very deeply and from time to time do write in, actually quite a bit. At CAS, a lot of it was on FATF, and it's been a nightmare, and so I've been deeply engaged with how this stuff really works. And so when I saw the case study of Russia, it is fascinating, and that's why I want to share some things with you. So, when we look at Russia and the sanctions that have been imposed on it, we should recognize that its experience with sanctions or with economic warfare has been informed by more than a century. After the October Revolution, there were very hardcore sanctions put on them. During the Cold War, there was many things implemented against them. And in the 21st century, for example, after 2014, and now. So they are not newbies in the field of recognizing the dimension of economic warfare as a part of total mobilization of one people against another, for example. So, in fact, geoeconomics has been the instrument of choice for Russia. The Georgian conflict, or the Crimean, or the Ukrainian, or the Syrian, these are exceptions, actually. It seems like a list, but it isn't. The rule is that they are very savvy geoeconomic players. I would argue that China and Russia are the savviest geoeconomic players. India aspires to it, but it's not very good at it. And America has actually kept geoeconomics less in its prism of tools than Russia and China. In fact, they could have done much more since the 90s, but they didn't. Part of it is ideology. Part of it is just that it is an orphaned subject, geoeconomics. In Pakistan, we have begun this narrative quite recently, and therefore we need to be far more informed about it in the way that these societies are in Russia and Ukraine. So, some things that they did, well, since in the last decade, for example, the creation of an economic zone of post-Soviet states to keep that orbit. But the positive geoeconomics includes writing off the debts of countries. So, for example, for Uzbekistan, they forgave the debts. That's on the positive side rather than the punitive side, negative side. Strategic bailouts to countries like Greece and Cyprus when the EU taka jama raha tha, Cyprus pe or Yunan pe, the Russians offered a bailout, and so the EU then had to behave in a way that was far more conciliatory. So, that is playing the sort of thing on the positive side. But on the negative side, partially withholding gas transfers via Ukraine because it has been a transit point for previous pipelines, and then simply rerouting pipelines. And if you look at the map of pipelines, I have one later on, they go around it so that they don't need to depend on Ukraine as a transit point. And then your kind of plain vanilla import restrictions and that sort of thing they have used against Georgia. So quite a large arsenal from there, where they are the agent rather than the respondent to the sanctions. This is a timeline since February, since the invasion. And you have several categories of sanctions that are put, and you see that the intensity was more marked in February and March, but echo or ripple waves have continued till the present, and they come in a variety of categories. Financial sanctions, that means cutting off the currency usage or the banking systems, access to SWIFT, etc. Oligarchs have been targeted particularly, but then import restrictions and export restrictions, travel, trade support. There's actually a large arsenal within the category that you would call economic sanctions, and you must be mindful of that. And quite a few governments have come on board, which would make you think that Russia would be in a lot of trouble economically, because so many countries are ganging up, in a sense, in retaliation, but using the economic domain as their arena of choice rather than kinetic, right? As the previous speakers correctly identified. But the Russians have taken countermeasures, timely and significant. And what I really am trying to get at here is the coordination of their economic machinery with the kinetic machinery, which is where we need to draw lessons. You may have the best kinetic thinkers and practitioners, but what degree of coordination exists with the economic thinkers and practitioners in our country? That is the real lesson here. So after the late February and early March, they began to take strong coordinated measures. For example, they raised a record interest rate, which is on the next slide. So here you see it was risen up to 30%. That's you would say madness. I mean, a crisis country wouldn't raise it to 30, but they did. They converted interest payments on their foreign loans into rubles. You want the money? We're not going to default, but we'll pay you in rubles. They curtailed the private ownership of foreign currency, and the corporate ownership of currency had to be converted. So if you took $100 million in income from abroad, well, 80% of it had to be parked in ruble. You had to then surrender that. Now it's 50%. Similarly, for the gas payments from the countries, they said you have to pay for it in rubles, which then forces a demand for the counterparty to purchase the rubles. And finally, they activated the central bank reserves that were not withheld by sanctions. So you've heard the 600 billion plus number, but it was diversified in anticipation of something like this. So it was dollars and yuan and euro and gold. And that portfolio then makes it. So you have these hedging instruments. So you anticipate this sort of situation and do that. As a result, 1 month into it, so this is a Bloomberg chart, by early April, it was actually one of the best performing, and year to date now, it is the best performing currency in the world. It is second on that list. And there's a whole list of other currencies that have actually degraded, and at year to date, actually, the worst performing currency relative to the US dollar year to date is our rupee, Pak rupee. Humne inka kya bigada, kisi ka kya bigada, but our currency is the one that is so disproportionately impacted. That's why this presentation is important to make today. Pak rupee. It's not on this list because it isn't liquid enough, but that's how bad things are, how unfair. And so the ruble itself, that is the graph, but this is an inversion. So this is the USD RUB. So you see that it was in, let's say, since 2018 trading at about 60 to 70, and then it fell, it's an inverted graph, to about 130 immediately. But because of those measures now, it is actually stronger now than any point in the last 4 years as a currency. Now, what is that? Having a strong currency may or may not be a good thing. For example, some countries try to keep their currency cheaper for exports, or because they cannot produce the equivalent currency. So the Swiss franc, for example, their central bank tries to keep it cheap, or the Japanese central bank tries to keep it cheap. So it isn't automatically a good thing, but for them, given the hemorrhaging that was anticipated of their currency, they haven't done that. In fact, we talk about current account surplus and current account deficit, so they are raking in about $20 billion a month now, during wartime. So current account surplus is what we're really looking at. Per month. Per month.
$20 billion per month.
Per month.
And if they start smuggling it out?
Just imagine. Per month. So you would imagine that they're in trouble, but they aren't. for now, and that's what I want to get to. So the energy exports, the gas sector is shouldering the burden, and so you do see a certain privilege for energy secure countries. That's why energy security goes in tandem with economic security, and that's why you should always remember, President Ipri, I made this presentation at your event also, that energy is the lifeblood of economics. All economics is a claim to energy, whether it is your labor power, whether it is the machinery, or whether it is the proper hardcore renewable and non-renewable sources of energy as it's understood, all of that. The other thing is the Western sanctions and the waves of businesses leaving the country actually led to a drop in the imports, because multinationals coming to your country require imports. They often prefer a certain quality. So their current account surplus expanded even more since the imports are less. Plus, those companies leaving often sold it to their local partner at throwaway prices. That's also a gain for the local partner. And finally, they're selling oil at a discount. Now, some countries are really, it's quite an unethical thing if they take a moral position against Russia, but then they continue to import. You know, there's an ethic part to that, economics. But if it's $120 a barrel, some countries are getting it at 90 from Russia, and they're happy to do that. So between the liberal orders, talk of human rights, and the actual practice, there's something to think about there. Now, the future challenges for Russia. So right now, you have what's called the kind of a new manifestation of the resource curse. Resource curse means that you sell petroleum or something that is energy rich, and then your currency appreciates. Because it is so strong, the rest of your industries are no longer competitive, so they sink and you become entirely dependent. This is a sort of different iteration of that, where Russia can basically chug through in terms of getting any foreign currency it needs, doesn't really want it because it's saying you buy in ruble. They can continue to do that, but other sectors of the economy are now very lopsided and disproportionately affected. The inflation rate is 18% plus, and unemployment is 10% plus, so there are macroeconomic issues there. Remember that loss of lives, particularly in Ukraine, which is the victim of an invasion, is a permanent loss. And they forecast, the best forecast is that Ukraine's GDP, we should also talk about that, will sink by about 45%. It is like the massive earthquake, which it is, or a volcanic eruption, which it is. And for now, they are prolonging their interest structure, the interest rate structure, by paying in rubles. But what if in the future the lenders prefer to write off that debt and have that default? What happens? I don't know. The best forecast is that Russia's GDP will drop by about 10 to 15%. So it isn't easy, despite what seems. So there you have two parallel sets of results, and you can hearken to whatever you would like. I'll tell you a certain sector that is benefiting. It's not even in Europe. More than half of the Pentagon's $6.5 billion portion of emergency spending package for Ukraine is designated simply to replenish the DoD's inventories. And Biden asked for a certain amount of stimulus. Congress was more than happy to give even more that was requested. Somebody is really, really happy about what is happening, and it's on a different continent. So, not everybody is so upset about what's happening in Ukraine, and that's something to think about. Now, there are some macro-level factors that we have to think as we pivot to the Pakistan situation. What has happened since this invasion in terms of the financial markets, which were already in turmoil and it's all over the place, not just because of this, but because of the inflationary pressures, because of lockdowns and supply chains, in general chaos, post-COVID stimulus now coming to a different sort of inflationary paradigm. It means that at the same time, the world's largest oil producer, which is Russia, along with Saudi Arabia and others, doesn't want euro or USD. It's not wanting to trade in that. And at the same time, Saudi Arabia is open to deals. That's a separate piece of news, but important, that they're willing to trade in yuan. So the petrodollar trade is also being challenged. So these two graphs, that is China's current account balance in USD. They've been accumulating dollars. That has been a strategy. Our strategy, which we should have but haven't been able to do, is to acquire dollars. This was also Mahathir's strategy for Malaysia. He raked in 100 billion over a long period, and that became Malaysia's anchor. This whole idea of stocking up on dollars is questionable when dollars are to be exchanged fundamentally for energy. And the US is on the right, the graph on the right, they've been going on a deficit paradigm. That graph is going back to 1960, and the drops start to happen particularly after the 90s. That's how long deficit spending by printing the dollar has worked. But will this strategy work in the future? If it doesn't, that will be a revolution in the world economy. Now, this is particularly true because in a panicked market, like you see, the turmoil of 2022, what you have is that if it's a deflationary bust, you will go for, meaning prices are low but the economy is bad, you can go into bonds. It's a safe asset. If it's inflationary and you have a bust, then you should go for the cash of the strongest currencies, which itself is quite shaky right now. So it's very hard for financial gurus to judge what to do. That's how big the crisis is. Not people here, but people in Tokyo and in New York and London are having a very hard time judging it. Why? Because with inflation, prices are high, but economy is bad, you have real yields sinking, which is to say the inflation-adjusted yields are negative. So if the Federal Reserve raises its primary interest rate by 1.5%, but inflation is so high it still doesn't cover it. So that makes the dollar even less attractive, and that is a very big deal. But what can the institutions, I'm not talking about Wall Street people, but in government institutions, the central banks do about it? Well, they don't have too much policy room. For so long, especially since 2008, they have been printing cheap money. And in 2020, they went gung-ho. But they didn't do it in a targeted manner like we did in Pakistan, where it was a small stimulus, but it was targeted towards the most cyclical industries like construction and towards the poor, through the old channel like the Benazir Income Support Program. So a little bit of money made a big difference. There, a ton of money was printed and only went to corporations. And there was a ton of corruption in it, in the West, but in the United States specifically. So emerging countries now have more options outside the euro or the dollar trade. That makes the whole multipolar world, as translated in economic sense, very important. And I'll tell you, oligarchs around the world are noting very carefully that they shouldn't be so keen to buy properties in London or something. You never know when it'll get snapped. There's no place like home. That paradigm is far more prominent now. And the weaponization of the dollar is now no longer a hush-hush subject. It was always done. It was always weaponized. But now it's like, well, this is sort of the new rules of the game. So you have a multipolar world where economic weapons are used willy-nilly. As the Minister of State mentioned, there are categories of thinking that must be deployed toward looking at sanctions. That has to be done. Okay. Why is energy, as I said, and I continue to say, all economics is a claim on energy fundamentally? Because energy has been a key driver of financial and economic health. You have two paradigms here on the left. It doesn't show the contrast well, but one part is orange and the right is green. The first, this is the MSCI China, so the stock market of China is reflected in a value-weighted index. That was the age of Chinese cheap coal that drove that. And the blue graph, which rose after that, was the age of cheap US shale. Those two revolutions are over, and now energy is being disrupted. So what's going to be the major driver? Coal. Look at the price of coal, which is that black graph. It has been nice and stable throughout this 3-decade period, while oil has led to shifts up. Coal has not been a very sexy thing to do. The climate activists rightfully point out the polluting nature of it, but coal has been basically the driver of the economic miracle that I have witnessed in my life, which is the rise of China, is all driven by coal, basically. And now, with this current situation, China has told its institutions, its agencies dealing with energy, "Keep bajao. Find coal at all costs, no matter what." So if you told me 5 years ago that the world economy is going to be topsy-turvy and that everybody is going to go back to coal, I would say, that's a very silly situation. How can it be? But that's exactly what is happening now. Because gas disruption at the same time, you can't use these pipelines, or there are issues with that, and Europe has promised to go away from pipeline dependency, so they are now purchasing LNG. That is the LNG that would typically go to Asia. So now the prices are higher for Asian energy, and so now we're impacted here. So instead of using this whole gas paradigm, we'd rather go to coal. This is, the last uptick there is Chinese coal production, and this graph goes back to 1986. Now, what does it mean for us? And there's 3 phases I'd like to point to you. There was a lot of turbulence pre-pandemic. So 2019, the dollar went from about 110, the rupee went from about 110 to $1. to 150. Then the pandemic came. That was a very interesting case study, and I'd like for us all to remain mindful of how well Pakistan did in that, economically and in public health terms. So we navigated it sensibly, but in the post-pandemic environment, we are in a much worse situation. The post-pandemic situation has been much worse for Pakistan than the pandemic could ever have been. And that's where we are right now. In November, we had about 21 billion with the State Bank in terms of foreign reserves. And as oil began to rise, particularly after February, our current account deficit came to about 4 billion per month. It shrunk down to about 9 billion. So there's 9 billion with the state bank's ambit, and then there's 6 billion extra dollars in the banking system, which is your money. And so that's how much it shrunk. Now we are so desperate for an IMF loan that we have to concede to things that would have been politically unpalatable, like removing the fuel subsidy, raising energy prices, etc. But there is one economic issue that isn't related to Russia and Ukraine, which has happened at the same time, which you must be mindful of because of its economic impact, which is that, for example, in April, Shanghai, the biggest port in the world, was closed down. Completely. 7 out of the world's 10 largest ports in terms of volume are in China. The world's biggest port is closed for a month. What is going to happen to global supply chains at the same time? So you have compounding effects everywhere. We're not entirely done with the pandemic for us to have even the stamina for the conflict happening right now. And at the meantime, the Federal Reserve has been printing money like there's no tomorrow. And it does really signal that there's no tomorrow. I mean, there really is no future interest rate path that makes sense. Unprecedented stimulus, poorly targeted, as I said, and the bubble has popped, the game is up. As General Saab said, it's peaked in power, it's also peaked in economic power, and now it seems to be receding. All of the things I'm pointing to corroborate this assertion. Now, for Pakistan, it isn't just about oil and gas, or even any other country that is import dependent on resources. Natural gas, Russia has 25%, platinum 23%, fine. But there are categories where Ukraine is also very important, for example, wheat, sunflower oil, corn. Even if you don't import this specific item, it is a substitute for something you import. And so that item's price increases too. And this is the trajectory since 2021 of the crude oil. I didn't even put the last 2 months, but waves of bouncing and bouncing and bouncing. And it's very bad now, same with natural gas. No matter which market's price you're looking at, very expensive. Wheat exporters in the world, this is pandemic era, but the data is slightly older than that. So 18 million tons from Ukraine, Russia, 37 million tons. Pakistan produces about as much wheat as Ukraine, but it doesn't export that because what it produces isn't enough to feed its people. Ukraine produces that much, but it has a decent-sized population. We have an indecent-sized population. The population growth is not sustainable. And that's why even though we have so many ne'matein and so much we still have to import, so we're vulnerable to these things. We shouldn't be, but we are. And you can see this in the indices, the sub-indices of the grains and oilseeds price index. So wheat is 62% more expensive than a year ago, maize is 32%, etc. You don't need to know the specific numbers. You feel it even when you go to the utility store. And then there's countries like Sri Lanka, which don't have anything to depend on to start with. They don't have something like the Punjab or the Sindh, which grows wheat. And so their case is very instructive because the decisions that they have been taking pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and after have all culminated into absolute damnation economically. So people here said, without looking at the economic history of Sri Lanka, could we be in the same situation? No. First of all, because we're more anticipatory, but second, because we're luckier in terms of our endowments. But don't look at just Pakistan and Sri Lanka and think of South Asia. Just imagine countries in the Middle East that are non-oil producing. Yemen imports 39% of its food. Palestine, Libya. Okay, what's going to happen to these countries? Look at the condition of Yemen before this war. And the same for something like Lebanon, which is already virtually bankrupt. So there's plenty of regions in the world. I won't even bring up sub-Saharan Africa. But the thing is that a conflict that is happening in the northern hemisphere in a generally cold climate with a rich soil is actually impacting the southern hemisphere. or the equator in a way that was unimaginable. So this is the condition in which we are now. And so even if you have, in this image, he has a fixed cycle, but he has to carry a mace. And you can swing that mace around, but until the global community works in a compassionate manner, understanding the suffering of Ukraine, and understanding how we all have to work together to solve the bigger problems, like not depend, God help us, we're using coal again, work towards solving the wicked problems together. These types of conflicts will erupt, and every time it will be harder for us to deal with it individually, rather than working as a world community in a sense of peace and brotherhood. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Usman. A great presentation, a very learning sort of for everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, our last speaker for this session is Squadron Leader, retired Farhat Masood. He's a former Pakistan Air Force pilot, well versed in the domain of air power, employment doctrine, and strategy. He will speak to us on the use of air power in the current crisis. Since he is not present here, it is going to be a virtual presentation by Squadron Leader Masood. Thank you.
Thank you, eminent guide here. It's very kind of President Kass and Kass itself to have invited me for this effort. I believe we've dealt a lot on the strategic issues that have been in place within the Russo-Ukraine conflict. My aim here is to look into the air power side, and I believe with the survey that I've done and the implications that we have seen, I believe there will be a lot of learning points for the audience overall. Let me quickly go across and stand by for it. Let me set things up a bit here. Right, so looking at the Ukraine crisis, it is indeed a watershed of many sorts, with seismic consequences for the international order and the systemic implications for national security, offering many air power lessons for the future. The conflict has underlined several realities in the hardball of international politics. The analysis which I present before you relied on several information types, including collection of analysis of primary and secondary sources of the war, including military and intelligence assessments from OSINT sources. Another was a force disposition map of the battlefield, in which analysts compiled and assessed Russian and Ukrainian air power's tactical and operational activity. While the war in Ukraine is likely far from over, this analysis comes to several conclusions which follow. This image here is a depiction of the air losses taken place by the ever-present Russian Air Force. Naming specific, we have the Su-30s being lost out left, right, center. We have the Su-25 Frankfurt images coming in, Mi-35 Heinz. So it is a major debacle that the Russian Air Force is going through with times to come. The sequence of my talk will be as flashed. We will be visiting lessons on policy and strategy over the course of next 15 minutes. We'll be ending up with disruptive technologies and a conclusion at the end. If you look at the combat comparison of the Russian-Ukraine air elements, the total helicopters, if you look at the Russian aspect, relates to Ka-27s, Ka-52s, the Kamovs, the Mi-24, 35 Heinz, all of that. Ukraine, a limited Mi-8 effort. On the fighter domain, we have a mix of high-low techs, where we know the Russians having the Su-57s to the Su-35 to 27s, as well as the MiG-29s. The Ukraine element of fighter command relates to MiG-29s, some Su-30s, and limited number of Su-27s. Ground attack aircraft, we're looking at Su-25s here, a mixed breed of attack aircraft with the Ukraine limited to about 30 there. Attack helicopters, once again, Ka-52 Kamovs. We have the Ukraine with limited firepower there as well. Special mission aircraft, which includes C-4ISR platforms and AEWs and AWACS, includes AN-30s, 50s, as well as IL-78s and IL-80s on the Russian side. Ukraine only individually operates the AN-30 on reconnaissance basis. This does not say that the air element is not being bolstered by NATO or the West. Yes, Ukraine had a lot of backing there. But if we look at numbers, overall, it is a 13-to-1 in case of air element. Fighters, 11:1, and the ground attack elements to 25:1. So the Russian Air Force overwhelms the Ukraine Air Force in whopping numbers. If you look at the losses themselves from the start of hostilities on 24th Feb till very recently, the Russians have, for all plausible purposes, lost out about 100 air defense systems, including 200 plus aircraft, about 180 helicopters in the process, UAVs, both on operational and tactical scale of things. This is once again a mix of high-low tech systems, which is huge considering what the Russian Air Force is capable of or was thought capable of at the onset of operations. Now let's consider the tenets of air power. This is a strategic scene of things. The golden air power tenet that overrides the rest of the six is CCDE. Specifically centralized, controlled, decentralized execution. In the conflict under consideration, the Russians, although have recently developed operational theater commands, but still have not done enough to decentralize the execution of operations. A major lesson for all users of aerial force to ensure the true utility of air power characteristics of speed, reach, and height. It needs to be led by an air commander without question. Kremlin, on the other hand, utilizes generals which are still dishing out air tasking orders to keep things under check. Logic behind this action can be either they do not want to escalate the war to a nuclear threshold level right now, but also look at securing assets for the long war against NATO. Last but not the least, CCDE is the core of operations as the golden tenet that I've mentioned and the major enabler as well. Delving into the operational level with relation to tactics, which will be covered in the next few slides, we'll be looking at the conventional air power domains. SEAD and DEAD are the first and foremost missions executed by any air force entering a battle zone. This results into freedom of operations by softening of air defense elements and in turn achieving favorable air situation. Since 24th Feb 2022, the Russian Air Force has not successfully neutralized surface-to-air missile systems, nor the counter-air elements of the enemy fighters. The plausible reason is one, the lack of sufficient EW tech use in operations initially, and with the West now backing Ukraine, this lack of SEAD and DEAD sorties are coming back to haunt the Russians in present and future times. The reluctance of Russia to use full array of air force is perplexing to say the least, as the establishment of air superiority or at least a favorable air situation is required for successful ground operations. Russia could have conducted speedy ground ops by using more air force. Prime examples was the Russian disastrous helicopter-borne assault on Kostomal Airport outside Kyiv, the home of Antonov aircraft and the joint AN-225 Myriad transporter. The capture of Kostomal airfield in the early stages would have helped to support the airborne forces in Kyiv and create an air bridge to sustain a follow-on ops by the ground forces. In the op, 6 to 7 helicopters were shot down in an opposed landing, along with 2 of the latest Ka-52 attack helicopters. The special forces involved in this aerial bridgeheads were then repulsed, causing 18 IL-76s with the main force to abort their flight and turn back to base. Despite this setback, the Russians attempted another air assault. This time, it reportedly lost 2 IL-76s in the process, one shot down by an Su-27 of Ukraine Air Force. Both these aircraft were full of paratroopers. More than 300 elite troops may have died in these operations. A high price, I say the least, that illustrates the danger, the danger of operating military transport aircraft in a contested airspace. Moving ahead, let's look at the Colonel John Boyd's OODA loop, known as the 42nd Boyd. If you look at the loop here, it was developed, this decision-making loop utilized by all reputable high reliability organizations. Goal of this ring is to ensure no matter how complex the situation, there are always tangibles that can be catered for. In the application to war scenarios, this becomes extremely dynamic and time constrained. If used correctly, one side can overwhelm the other by working inside the adversary's decision-making loop by being brisker, faster, and quicker. I'd like to move on in a practical application of this OODA loop to observe Air Force data and information collection assets maintain constant surveillance over theater of operations through ISR platforms being one, satellites, AWACS, AEW platforms, etc., gaining and maintaining orientation. Intelligence personnel, AWACS operators, air planners process huge amounts of data to find targets to attack and re-attack, and how to disrupt enemy operations to enable decision-making by air commanders to determine how to support the bigger objective. The prioritization of targets, the allocation of resources, and the timing, as well as the tempo of air operations through the master air attack plan and daily ATOs or air tasking orders to disseminate guidance to units throughout the theater. To enact air power assets are employed to conduct strategic lift and bombing, interdiction, close air support, armed recce, and PSYOPs in support of the bigger goals. Cutting the long story short, Ukraine Air Force has been successful to operate inside the Russian decision-making loop. Now turning to the principles of war. Out of the 9 principles of war which are there, instrumental in reducing the supposed fog of war, both clarity of military and political objectives is right there at the top. If I were to say Gulf War I, Schwarzkopf sent to the POTUS 3 political objectives, for which one was reportedly added by Bush Sr. with his left hand in ink, to protect Americans at home and abroad. And this was before the D-Day of operations of Gulf War I. In the Russo-Ukraine conflict, there is supposedly zero, if at all, no clarity in both political and military objectives of the conflict. What to say of putting them on paper? Once again, political and military objectives require clarity. Next, I'll focus on the possible political objective. Russia failed to achieve what was likely its main political throw, to overthrow the Kyiv government in a blitzkrieg military operation. Remember, operations ongoing, this is all plausible thinking. On the other side, we have military objectives, once again possible. To gain and maintain feet on ground as deep as possible into Ukraine territory, to utilize at the negotiation table post-hostilities. These both become crucial in the long term of things. Last but not the least, disruptive tech. This is the contemporary and the future of air power. And if we go into details, Russia has used its Kinzhal Dagger hypersonic, hypersonic missiles in Ukraine for the very first time. This also points to the limited availability of precision munitions and their selective usage of high-value targets by Russia. The Kh-47M2 is a Russian nuclear-capable hypersonic aeroballistic air-to-surface missile. Reported accuracy of 1 meter, Russia used this Kinzhal NATO-named Killjoy hypersonic missiles in Ukraine on 18th of March 2022 to neutralize underground weapon storage units in Western Ukraine's Ivano-Frankivsk, and on 19th March at fuel storage sites in central Ukraine in Mykolaiv region. The aerial reconnaissance unit of Ukrainian Armed Forces, Aerospace, has demonstrated technological wizardry of another level. It has leveraged the Starlink terminals, offering high data rates for stable communications enabled by low Earth orbit satellites configuration provided by the all-famous Elon Musk, very effectively for drone strikes against the traditional prima donnas of combat, namely tanks, artillery, air defense, and other Russian combat instrumentalities. The terminals have also been used by President Zelensky for STRATCOMs, as was mentioned by one of the speakers before. Poor intelligence and military casualties were the reasons for Russia's slow progress. Among the many explanations, one is the Russian Air Force used less IR assets, such as ISR assets, such as light drones or the assets that could keep up with the tanks due to Ukraine's anti-drone tactics, air defense and electronic warfare networks. According to images available on OSINT, Russian ISR drones tracked Ukraine's BM-21s to their concealed hideouts and destroyed the BM-21's batteries as well. On the flip side, the Ukraine's military was using counter-drone UAV systems during the heavy fighting around Mariupol. Ukrainian military used its Turkish-made TB2 drones to strike Russian convoys in the initial stages, but now their use has been reduced down due to attrition and limited numbers. Drones have been seminal as Russian tank columns that came close to Kyiv from the north, and the airport were ambushed and stalled by drone attacks as well. The Switchblade Puma Recce drone, combination of two-man teams, allowed the engagement of Russian tanks from a safe distance of 5 to 6 kilometers. Loitering munitions, as known as suicide drones or kamikaze drones as they are known, like Ukraine's Switchblade S-300 and 600 with extended range loitering missiles, delivered unprecedented reconnaissance, surveillance, and target acquisition support, and featuring high precision optics over 40 minutes of loitering endurance, and as anti-armor warhead for engaging larger and hardened targets at greater distances. ST-35 Silent Thunder was also a weapon of choice, which searches for targets and uses reconnaissance data from other sources and attack once the target is located. Having a vertical trajectory on target attacks, Silent Thunder can destroy the target in densely populated urban areas with minimum risk of collateral damage. Russians, once again, using Kub, loitering munitions made up by Kalashnikov, flew at about 130 kilometers per hour with 30 minutes of flight time and payload capabilities. Russia conducted also an EW campaign against the Ukrainian forces. Russia initially has invested heavily in EW systems capable of shutting down communications and signals across a broad EM spectrum. This capability is grouped under the concept of radio electronic batteries. In the early morning of February 24, 2022, for example, Russia jammed Ukrainian air defense radars across all frequency bands. Russia also used E-95M UAVs, which simulated Russian aircraft, harassed Ukrainian radars to draw out their air defenses. Russian military also faced considerable operational challenges, in part because they were being followed up by the Americans and the electronic warfare platforms of NSA and the DoD. As a conclusion of my analysis, there are a few learning points that I would like to ponder and leave the audience for thought. Air superiority or dominance is critical for successful theater-wide operations. Appropriate CCDE remains pivotal in true application of air power led by an air commander. Political and military aims of any conflict, if documented, will ensure quantifiable accomplishments for any war. Shorter, faster, brisker decision-making loop within the enemy's sphere will result into winning the battle and the war. Disruptive tech is the way forward to guarantee triumph in both peace, kinetic, non-kinetic, and warlike scenarios. The debate of the art of war continues. The question is, which impacts air power plays on the outcome of the Russo-Ukraine war? Russia's overconfidence in numbers and misuse of air power as a mere ground support single element force will make them lose many a battle, if not the war. They need to learn and learn fast. Otherwise, the game will run away from them very quickly. On the other hand, Ukraine has been creative in the application of air power. Instead of maintaining status quo, and with the West bolstering in support in more than a few aerial arenas, they will remain a formidable force to reckon with. Teaching the West, air parity is good enough for smaller air forces to survive. I thank you all.
Thank you, Squad Leader Masood Sahab. Ladies and gentlemen, the choice was between question-answer session and the lunch that is also ready. And besides, some of the guests also had to leave a little early. So I think with great regret, we are going to skip the question-answer session. And I would now request Air Marshal President Farhat Sahab, President CAS, to deliver his concluding remarks as well as vote of thanks. Thank you so much.
So do you want to play the video? It's here. Should I do it?
Okay, no. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. At the fag end of the day, while you're waiting for lunch, I'll take 2-3 minutes to wind up the session. Some of the very important lessons that have come out of this presentation by various learned speakers, I just need to, I think, sum up for our purposes. Number one, Ambassador Riaz very rightly pointed out that UN is ineffective and the challenges are galore at the international arena. In that, General Aamer said, and very rightly, the security is our own business, and quoted the example of Ukraine denuclearization. So these are important lessons pertinent for us. We don't expect support or anything from United Nations if we think we will get on any issue that we are engaged. The world order is in disorder. That is what Ambassador Saab said, but I think very rightly pointed out. And the world is changing fast. In fact, General Aamer said it has already changed. So that is the frequency that we have to catch up as far as Pakistan's policy makers are concerned. We have to be as fast as the world is changing. We have to be as quick as things are happening. And we have to be as correct as things are to be. And I think the morning's first speaker highlighted our policies, and I think that was adequately highlighted that in the international arena, we have to be neutral in handling various policies, and we have to decide what to do. General Aamer also pointed out in Russia, the reason for success, continuity of leadership, strategy, and therefore effectiveness of policy was the key issue. And most of the speakers pointed out, that if you want to have peace there in Ukraine and related elements, Russian security concerns will have to be addressed. I don't think there is going to be peace without that, whether the war ends now or it ends later. Coming back to some of the important things at our front, as Dr. Usman also pointed out, I'll just go through it. When our Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, went to Russia on 24th February 22, two things happened. When the Prime Minister landed on a pre-planned visit, the guns started firing. While it was surely a coincidence, analysts could not have possibly imagined that this coincidence would have the potential to shake up the entire political landscape of Pakistan. Secondly, the war had often been analyzed from a number of aspects. Kinetic engagements of a superpower with the largest state of Europe, second largest state of Europe, redefining the contours of world order, and most importantly, its economic dimensions. However, some of us could not have guessed at that time that this European war would have the potentials to shake up the economies of countries like Pakistan and many more, in the form of inflation and food security. On the economic front, Dr. Usman highlighted various aspects. Some of the things that I want to highlight. Imagine today one of the facts of the war. India, a country which as per the US policy is supposed to checkmate China, is buying discounted fuel from Russia in Chinese currency. What a change. That compels me to leave a question for all thinking minds. with so much in common between China and India, whatever happens to the Asia-Pacific or the India-Pacific strategy, will they ever go into war on the behest of somebody? I don't think China and India are that far away from each other. So it's for the policymakers to think they're not going to confront each other, because they have, today, I think, about $60 billion of mutual trade. Therefore, while the war continues, it would have very interesting lessons for all think tanks, strategists, as well as economists to draw their own conclusions as and when the war ends. It would definitely need a reappraisal when the war ends. Ladies and gentlemen, our response to Russian invasion, the US-led West stayed away from interfering in the war through kinetic means and opted to punish Russia through non-kinetic means and economic strategy. In that, they moved on to supply financial aid package to Ukraine and adopted the strategy of economic measures, including sanctions on Russia in selected fields in a regulated fashion. Support in the field of non-kinetic warfare, despite huge infrastructure destruction and human losses, did help Ukraine in sustaining its war efforts. The sanctions-based strategy, however, does not seem to have worked well due to effective counter-strategy of the Russians, which managed to maintain a resilient posture, healthy trade balance, and stronger currency. Various measures taken by Russia, I would just list. First, before the war, they built up reserves to the order of 600 billion in various hybrid manner. They had dollars, they had euros, they have pounds, in yuan, and gold. So they were not stuck with one currency. That's one. They increased the interest rate right in the beginning of the war to about 30%. What did it do? It helped retain the wealth inside Russia. So affected lesser inflation. Very effective strategy. As Dr. Usman pointed out, all obligatory payment done by Russia or were in rubles. They did not use any other currency to pay things, pay to the buyers. This avoided depletion of foreign exchange reserves and also default on payments to the international lenders. They curtailed corporate ownership of the currency. Nobody could have more than 20% of his income in foreign currency. Now, a few words about the effectiveness of the US strategy. So, US adopted a strategy of attriting Russia through non-kinetic means and economic sanctions. The strategy does not seem to have so far brought Russia to its needs, which was the US objective, possible objective to bring down Russia. However, if the war gets prolonged, which in my view is the US objective, the US has good chance of gaining out of the war, because the Russians would start to lose in a prolonged war. How? Number one, the Russian military will get attrited during the course of time. Therefore, at the end of war, whenever it is end, the delta of force balance between United States and Russia would extend. Russians would have a depleted force, whatever amount, and the Americans have stayed away, so they would start to call Russia irrelevant in the military domain. Therefore, they would try and make them irrelevant in China, Russia, US equation. After the war, Russia would need to reconstruct its military arsenal at least to a pre-war figure or a volume. This would need huge money. Therefore, the economic effect would come where tomorrow or after, which is once again the US objective. Therefore, allow me to conclude, prolong the war, it favors the United States, not the Russians. Probably Russia is stuck from that point also. How to culminate, when to culminate, what should be the strategy. With that, I come to the end, and I like to thank the panel, already introduced by the moderator, Ambassador Jalil Abbas, but like to say a few words myself. Ambassador Riaz Khokhar is, he was my boss in India. We served together for about a year and a half. And as he was trying to point out in the beginning, he was known as firebrand ambassador in New Delhi. And in fact, this was his reputation. So one day he was to address the Indian National Defense College, and I accompanied him to the National Defense College. He was formally introduced as firebrand ambassador in New Delhi. So that's his reputation. Indians were really scared of him. So very able ambassador. I really enjoyed working. We thank him for being with us today, and we'd like to see more. And I do not need to comment any further. He's a much taller figure in our diplomatic arena, where people learn from his talks, discussions, and knowledge. Lieutenant General Aamer, I think Ambassador Riaz concluded it very well. General of the generals. So, sir, thank you very much for coming here. We like to have more of you here. Thank you. And Dr. Usman, our pillar of Directorate of Economy, who is always full of knowledge. He always has to reduce what he has in his mind in terms of knowledge. MashaAllah, a scholar, a writer, an analyst, and what all at this young age. And let me mention his proud parents are sitting here in this hall. So thank you very much for it. And at the end, Farhat in Oman, thank you very much for enlightening us on the employment of air power. If I understood your lecture correctly, this was a typical, if I may conclude, the employment of Russian Air Force. It is a typical way of not employing an air power. They do nothing, and often the media has called it a missing Air Force. There's one last point. We often understand that we read the Western media, and then all our input comes from the Western media. So therefore, Ukrainian war will continue to be evaluated in times to come. But I have a statement of the Russian foreign minister, and I'd like you to listen to that.
Conflict, there are some advices to calm you down. First, imagine that this is happening in Africa. Imagine this is happening in the Middle East. Imagine Ukraine is Palestine. Imagine Russia is the United States.
Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, the lunch is served, and we would be, oh yes, before we leave for lunch, the President will present souvenirs to the distinguished members of the panel. And a group photograph will follow that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I would now like to request President Gass to present mementos to our esteemed speakers. Firstly, I would request Ambassador Riaz Khokhar to receive your memento. I would now like to request General Aamer to please receive your memento. I would now like to invite Dr. Usman Chohan to receive his memento. Sir, group photograph. I would now like to request the panelists for a group photograph.